Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political institutions and their evolution. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome everyone to today's Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is the 13th day of November, and if you don't mind doing things on the 13th, then I appreciate you being tuned in to us today. I want to begin right away by sharing with you our phone number and encouraging you to use it. We'll begin with a little bit of review of what we did yesterday, and then we'll kind of continue on that vein, hopefully. But our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to email me directly with your ideas or your questions or considerations or opposition or ideas or suggestions or whatever you might have, by all means, I really would. I'd appreciate hearing from you very, very much. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Let me first begin by making comment of the fact that we are on 1 hour earlier today. And we will be doing the same this coming Monday as well. We'll be running from 3 to 5. As I mentioned last night, I have a board meeting to chair at 5:30 at our Appalachian Hospital here in Beckley on Monday evening at 5:30. And tonight I have a board of directors of the Beckley Rotary Club dinner meeting to change, board meeting to change, to chair rather, not to change, the chair at 5:30 this evening. So that's the reason for these two changes. I really do. I'll be honest with you. I kind of like the 4 to 6 time. As I think about my day-to-day life, 4 in the afternoon to 6 in the afternoon is probably the time when I get the least accomplished anyway. And what I mean is it's really ideal because, to be very honest with you, it turns the least productive 2 hours of my normal day into the best part of my day, which is the 2 hours that we spend together. And I appreciate it so very much, and I appreciate your interest and your support and your comments, whether they be by phone while we're on the air or by email afterwards. I get every once in a while I get just the most encouraging comments, and it just makes me feel so good to believe that maybe together we're really, hopefully we're accomplishing some good things. I'm hoping that we're beginning a process that will continue to expand and will actually attract more listeners. And we'll obviously encourage more people to participate actively on the phone. One of the things that Bob Kincaid keeps telling me is the idea of getting a chat room here up and running, so that I can respond to comments that you would type in on your computer, and I can make comments to them at the moment that these things arrive. And we're going to have to do a little bit of work on that. Part of my issue there, very honestly, is my vision. I have if I have this microphone in front of me, I have to sit so far away from the computer that I really have trouble reading text unless I really get up close and squint, and I can't do that and use the microphone at the same time. So anyway, we'll figure out a way. No question. But the fact of the matter is, as I mentioned, we're beginning an hour early today, and we will be doing the same this coming Monday. And I've thought a lot about our program yesterday and about the one hopefully that'll follow it up today. because it also is going to be on the Common Core standards and educational reform in America, not only K through 12 reform, but also higher education reform. Excuse me. I really believe that there are some pertinent, relevant issues here, and it's very, very interesting. I think that I'm going to basically share with you a little story that happened yesterday from one of my classes, senior citizens class. When I sat down this afternoon to do the program, I had no idea that I was going here, but here we are, and it seems quite appropriate. As I mentioned, I'm teaching a college class 3 days a week. I taught this morning, and right now we're entering the last third of our semester. Excuse me, and we're moving towards the sectional crisis that produced the Civil War. The semester ends with the war, and so we're talking about the gaps, the differences between North and South, and we're talking about the institution of slavery and how historians have treated it over the years, how they've written about it, and trying to get our arms around a very, very difficult subject. A number of years ago, I adopted a strategy of dealing with the institution of slavery, which I've pretty regularly stuck to since over the last several years. And it's basically one of looking at slavery as an institution. And what I mean by that is dealing a little bit with the sociological concept of institutions, of human man-made institutions as a concept. You know, what is, and most people have heard the word all the time, so, you know, the institution of slavery, the institution of government, the institution of politics, et cetera, et cetera. But very, very few people ever spend serious time reflecting on that and thinking about that. But over the years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the whole idea of institutions, and very specifically, the more I did that, the more comfortable I became with this particular approach to addressing the institution of slavery in a regular survey American history class. And what I ended up doing when we began this particular topic was just on the blackboard. Actually, it's a whiteboard. It tells you we've come a long way. It tells you where I come from. But I wrote the terms, the words slavery as, and then I put a colon, and then I made a list of things that one could consider slavery to be. And the first one was slavery as institution. And then I looked at the issue of slavery as a human rights issue. And that gets into the whole question of humanity itself and the violations of the precepts and the tenets of humanity. And then I got into the issue of slavery as a labor system. And then slavery as an institution, as an economic system. And then slavery as a means for social control of slaves, of blacks. But also slavery as a form of control for whites. And what we did this morning in class, we were talking about the structure of Southern society and the so-called planter elite or aristocracy in the pre-war Southern hierarchy. And we looked directly in our textbook and saw the numbers, which suggests that relatively speaking, there weren't that many Southerners who qualified to be termed a planter. You know, and the way the textbook approached the subject, which I think is a very good way, a creative way. If you assume that anybody who owns at least 20 slaves can be called a planter, there still weren't that many of them in the pre-Civil War South. And the fact of the matter is, as the years went on, more and more of the slaves were owned by fewer and fewer of the planter aristocracy. So in other words, what we had going on in the pre-Civil War South was exactly the same thing that we have going on in our society today, which is the emergence of extreme inordinate inequality in the distribution of wealth and power throughout society. And of course, we're only talking about Southern society here. And the fact of the matter is, only 1 in 30 Southerners who owned slaves could qualify to be called a planter if the minimum of 20 slaves is the cutoff. And yet there were, I think there were 111 planters that owned more than 500 slaves. One that owned more than I think more than 1,000. But the fact of the matter is, you had a very, very few people who were benefiting from the institution itself. Yet at the same time, the entire Southern society fought a war and saw many of its young die in defense, theoretically in defense of that institution. In defense of that institution as a keystone in the Southern way of life. And so the question becomes, what is it that prompts non-slave-holding whites to take up arms and support an institution that doesn't appear to be directly benefiting them? And if you look at the scholarship surrounding this topic, it becomes clear that the institution of slavery and success as a planter became the definition of success in Southern society. In other words, it's what non-slave-holding whites hoped to become. And so consequently, they were defending an entire way of life, which they had been there since they were born. And they obviously clung to each other in opposition to those who would challenge and contest the morality of that institution and of their society itself. But basically, what we're basically talking about here is the fact that the institution not only benefits those who are directly benefiting from it, but it also benefits in terms of controlling not only slaves, but also whites, because it basically becomes the value system which drives Southern society. And so consequently, in a very indirect way, the institution of slavery is helping Southern society control poor whites, because it's maintaining the existence of an institution that really comprises the bulk of the meaning of success in that particular society. And there was a book that was written in 1857 by Hinton Helper called The Impending Crisis of the South. And Helper did an analysis of Southern society in which he pointed this out. He was talking to non-slave-holding whites in the South in his book. And his basic point was, slavery's killing you people and you don't even know it. Those that are benefiting from it, that are getting rich from this institution, are using the existence of that institution to control you, to keep you in line, to keep you in order. Not only that, but by maintaining a slave system, they are basically putting themselves in a position of using race to control you. In other words, however badly they may be doing, the fact that there are whites and there's always somebody below them on the totem pole, which are the slaves, then they are basically able to claim a sense of superiority, no matter how low they go in terms of social and economic well-being. So in a sense, the institution of slavery is controlling whites and creating stability and order in Southern society just by its very existence. It's not only controlling slaves, but it's also controlling whites as well. It's keeping everybody in order, and it's basically defining or helping to define the value system of that society. And then you go back to the idea of slavery as an economic institution. But the point that I was going to make at the outset was that in the my senior citizens class yesterday, we were talking about something quite different. But we were talking about exactly the same thing we're talking about here at the Virtual Center, which is the Common Core standards and the whole issue of reform and all the rest of it. I brought to them a copy of the letter that I read yesterday to the Catholic bishops from the Catholic scholars of 132 Catholic scholars from around the country, criticizing the Common Core standards. And the people in my class, the seniors in my class, launched into a discussion about education reform, and I would say probably close to half of the group are retired teachers. So they had, this is a subject that they willingly tie into whenever it comes up. And a couple of them made general statements, but one of the things that occurred, which I thought was very interesting, and this is the point I wanted to make here, is that in the midst of a very, very solid piece of reasoning and analysis that one of the members of the class was making about education, he paused for a minute, and then he kind of looked around at everybody, and he said, the more I think about it, the one thing, all of us have been in school, all of us have been students, every one of us. Half of us, close to half of us, have been teachers. So consequently, if there's anything that we really believe that we know something about, it's education and reform. And I made the point in response to that is exactly the point I was making to my history class about the institution of slavery. There's no way in the world to convey to people what the institution of slavery was like, because none of us have really ever experienced that in its totality. But we've all been students. Every one of us, no matter where we grew up, we've all been students, and we've had the experience of being trained and oriented to basically succeed in that institution. In other words, we learn very quickly how to behave and how to act and what's expected of us and everything else. And the fact of the matter is, that's really what the key ingredients of an institution are. Institutions create order and stability in society by imposing a set of rules and habits and behavior. And the institutions reward positive behavior and they punish negative behavior. And it doesn't take long before the people who are functioning within the institution become almost totally dependent upon it. The example of this would be prisons, for example. The correction system and the numbers of people who have spent years and years in jail or in some kind of a very, very rigid, controlled institutional setting like a prison or even a mental hospital or something, and that you learn very quickly what works and what doesn't, and how to be rewarded and how not to be punished and all the rest of it. And after a while, you become so dependent on that order, on those rules, that there's an element of security that you derive as an individual from the institution, and you become very resistant to anybody's efforts to change it. Because change is very, very difficult for people. It always was, and it always will be. And so consequently, you can almost speculate on what the ingredients of an institution are by just observing the people who function within it. In other words, when you watch how people act and listen to what they say and what they believe and what they don't believe, what they value and what they don't value, you can almost speculate as to what the rules of the institution might be, because these people are following them perfectly. In other words, you can look at the behavior and you can pretty well guess what the behavior is a response to, what kind of rules and what kinds of expectations and all the rest of it. And if you use that strategy, you can begin to get some idea of what being a slave within the institution of slavery might have been like. You know, when you begin to look at things like total control, when you begin to look at issues like destroying one's independence and one's will, destroying all support systems so the person becomes totally dependent on the institution of slavery itself, breaking up families, selling off children, all the rest of it. In other words, you try to make sure, consciously try to make sure, that there's no support system available, so nobody can get any sense of relief except from within the institution itself. And so you're building up total dependency, which in turn produces, in theory, total control. And what you're basically doing is breaking the will and the independence of people, or trying to. And of course the ideal would be you would take away, you would totally destroy the idea of rebellion, or the idea of revolt, or the idea of running away, or anything else, by suggesting that none of that can work. And of course we know now that there were rebellions and there was efforts at sabotage and efforts to violate the system. But my point is, by understanding the nature of institutions, you can begin to see how different institutions are supposed to work, what they require. Also, you can begin to recognize where institutions are vulnerable, where the key points are. You know, and so the irony is, because everybody was a student, that's something we all have in common, then that's an institution we can all talk about, because we've all been there. And the fact of the matter is, the transfer from the institution of education over to the institution of slavery is sometimes a very comfortable one, because in many ways the goals of the two institutions are somewhat the same. That irritates students, but the fact of the matter is, it's true. What we're talking about is control and morality and values and virtue and all the rest of it. And you know, there's a transfer there that's very obvious. Uncomfortable, yes, but obvious. And so those are the examples that I was using from my class about this issue of education. And one of the reasons I feel so comfortable talking about it is because it's something that everybody who hears can relate to, because everybody's been through it. Education everywhere functions the same way. It favors or rewards certain things, and it discourages other things, and they tend to be the same things. And so I think that's very significant. So when you start talking about reform, about improving the system, chances are that most people are going to come at that question of reform from a background that's pretty well informed. But on the other hand, from a background that has pretty well defined the choices for the people in this conversation. Most people who came through the educational system and experienced some level of success in it are pretty comfortable with the institution and its rules and regulations and assumptions and outcomes and all the rest of it. So therefore, when you're talking about reforming it, people are coming at that issue having already been institutionalized, if that makes sense. In other words, having already been indoctrinated into that particular institution, into its rules and its regulations and its aspirations and its expectations and its fears and its options and all the rest of it. So therefore, certain suggestions for reform are looked upon positively, and others are just absolutely out of the question. I mean, people just say that can't work. And everybody seems to be an expert on this because everybody's been through it. Anyway, yesterday we were talking about the Common Core standards, which is the latest reform effort in the country. It was taking off. It was moving very, very, very positively. And of course, as we know, and I read the yesterday portions of the Charles Blau article in August from the New York Times, which contains an awful lot of the data about how far we have to go in order to get back to where American education used to be. We've slipped way down in math and in reading and the sciences, in literacy, in reading levels and writing ability and all the rest of it. Technology, for example, is offering us wonderful things. But one of the things that technology is doing is effectively killing the ability to write cursive. When I was in school, there were classes on penmanship and how to write neatly. Now we are beginning to experience students who can't write at all. All they can do is print. And of course, that's tedious and slow. Because most people, and many people, bring iPads or laptops or whatever to class, and that's the way they write. They type. And so consequently, the whole idea of cursive, of writing cursive, and whether in fact it's a dying skill and whether we can afford to let it die, I think is a significant reform question in education as well. But we looked at all of the positive things that theoretically the Common Core standards, which focus on college readiness and career readiness, all the things that it was supposed to do, and then I read this letter from Gerard Bradley at Notre Dame Law School to every Catholic bishop in the United States, encouraging every archdiocese, every Catholic operation in the country to forego the Common Core standards or not be sucked into this wave of support. Right now, 45 states, along with the District of Columbia, have endorsed the Common Core standards, and these people are basically raising a red flag and saying, wait, don't go any further. If you haven't done it yet, don't. If you have done it, pause and rethink. But stop implementation. And the suggestion in the letter, of course, is that rather than improve the quality of education, the Common Core standards to these folks seem more likely to dumb down the quality of education by instead of addressing the issue of college education or the issue of K through 12 education by giving everybody the chance potentially to go to college. The assumption now is what we need to do is make sure that everybody has the skills and knows what they need to know in order to get a job and to pursue a career. Some of them will go on to college, but that's up to them. And so in reality, what we're seeing in a kind of backdoor kind of way is really, from this perspective, I'm not saying this is an absolute fact, but this is what these people believe, is that effectively employers have taken control of public education, and they have turned the system around to the point that the principal objective of our K through 12 education systems is to prepare people for the workplace. And of course, what's spurring that is the idea of globalism, global competition, the information revolution, the communication revolution, the fact that we're competing with peoples around the world who have access to this technology that we never competed with before. And so consequently, we've got to turn out more qualified people for the workplace with more workplace-ready skills, and that in order for us to compete successfully in the 21st century world, then those need to become the objectives of our entire education system. And it's that objective that Gerard Bradley and the folks who signed this letter are really raising hackles about. I mentioned yesterday the organization, the Princeton University-based organization called the National Association of Scholars. They now have moved their headquarters from Princeton, New Jersey to Manhattan. They did that last year. But it's still, very heavily weighted with Princeton people. And I mentioned the academic questions, the journal that I have, and the fact that in the spring 2013 journal are 2 articles on the Common Core standards. And these articles are understandably very negative toward the Common Core standards, one more so than the other. And they give us a little bit more detail than does the letter of the Catholic scholars to the bishops. That kind of skirts around the edges and implies a lot of things in terms of problems about the Common Core standards. But these articles give us a lot of hardcore information. And so if you'll bear with me, I wanted to basically lay some of this out because I think it's significant. And the very first sentence addresses the Common Core standards idea of producing students who are college and career ready. And the author of this article makes the point that that's quite a bit different from what we used to talk about when we talked about education, which was, what does a student need to know in order to be an educated citizen? So now, instead of what does the student need to know, now the issue is, what do they need to be able to do in order to be college ready and or career ready? And then we get the standards and the article. By the way, the article is called, the title of the article is Uncommonly Bad. And the author is Jane Robbins. And let me tell you a little bit about who Jane Robbins is. She is a senior fellow with the American Principles Project based in Washington, D.C. In this position, I'm reading the piece at the bottom of the page, the footnote. In this position, she has crafted federal and state legislation designed to restore the constitutional autonomy of states and parents in education policy and to protect the rights of religious freedom and conscience. So that pretty well tells us where Jane Robbins is coming from. She basically believes in the idea that education is a state function, not a federal function, and so consequently she sees her role as doing everything she can do in order to put parents and states back in the driver's seat in terms of education as opposed to the federal government, which means that she would probably be, I'm just guessing here, would be opposed to and maybe even an advocate of the abolition of the U.S. Department of Education, which a lot of conservatives in the country currently are. But also the fact that to protect the rights of religious freedom and conscience. And of course, this is the idea that K through 12 education, because of the ability of the federal government to control so much of it, is becoming very secular. And you know, the idea of separation of church and state, and the ideas that issues of morality and spirituality and all the rest of it that are important parts of a nation's education system really have no comfortable place in ours. And obviously she's a fan of reversing that trend. Basically, and I've underlined a number of things here because I want to emphasize them. She believes and says these and other Common Core proponents, she talks about the extent to which the Obama administration and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, and on and on and on, are supporters of these standards. And she makes this point and says these and other Common Core proponents advocate a single set of standards. In other words, rather than education being being locally controlled, we're moving into a national system of control where all education is held up to the same set of standards. This bothers her constitutionally because she says, and the next few words in this sentence I think will explain it, when she says advocate a single set of standards and inevitably a single curriculum implemented throughout the nation and controlled by experts in Washington rather than parents. And I think you get an idea as to where her concerns about the Common Core standards are coming from. The other thing she points out in the article, which I think is very, very relevant, is the fact in order to get states to buy into these Common Core standards, the U.S. Department of Education has offered states the chance to compete for federal money by buying in. The president's program, which is usually called Race to the Top, which makes a lot of money for your education system available if you buy into these standards. Also, so many states are having problems with the Bush administration's No Child Left Behind program that the Department of Education is offering waivers and more flexibility in No Child Left Behind for states that buy into and agree to subscribe to these Common Core standards. So in a sense, there's all sorts of federal pressure on states to buy into these standards. There's money associated with it, and there's all sorts of flexibility in the No Child Left Behind program, to the point that 45 states in the District of Columbia have indeed bought into it. Jane Robbins says, Common Core supposedly will enable students to transition seamlessly to college or work and ultimately compete in the global economy, unquote. That's a quote from the standards themselves. And then the author, Jane Robbins, proceeds to tell us what this means. What this actually means, she says, is that students will be trained for jobs, a concept recycled from earlier progressive theory but given a new twist. And of course what she's doing now is criticizing progressive educational reform that occurred in early in the 20th century, most associated with the philosopher John Dewey. And John Dewey's whole approach to philosophy was to education was trying to marry education with the world that people had to live in. And the more practical we could make the curriculum, the more students could buy into it and relate to it, and the better education they would get. In the English curriculum, she says, Common Core will also focus less on knowledge and more on critical thinking and higher order thinking skills. This lofty language, long trumpeted by progressive educators, may advance a political agenda more than it does effective education. Quite simply, Common Core is a radical redirection in American education. Jane Robbins has introduced a factor, a consideration into this debate that we really didn't have yesterday, and it's not that evident in the letter of the Catholic scholars to the bishops. And that is the issue of politics, of a political agenda. And the mention of her mention of progressivism and progressive theory in education, and the extent to which the Common Core standards are very consistent with those progressive ideas and objectives suggests the political position that she's coming from. When you start talking about replacing knowledge with something called critical thinking and or higher order thinking skills, then you're moving into skill building, training, more than you are into substance. You're moving away from content, away from substance, into strategy, into the mechanics of thinking. And she claims that this will have a distinct, that this might be reflective of what she believes is a political agenda more than effective education. I think it's important to pause on that and reflect and speculate a little bit as to how politics works its way into this. Yesterday, I made reference to the so-called education wars of the 1970s and 1980s, and the extent to which those wars seem to revolve around teaching of reading, the phonics system versus the whole language system. And the idea of the whole language system was to get away from the total focus on content, which was really driving K through 12 education in America. Facts, facts, facts. And people used to quote all the time, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but Charles Dickens' very famous Hard Times. If you've read Hard Times by Charles Dickens, which is kind of the downside of the Industrial Revolution, the way poor people and working people lived or didn't live. And there's a tremendous scene in one of the chapters there where the children of the poor go to school, and the teacher's name is, the teacher's last name is Gradgrind. And if you've ever seen any reference to the name Gradgrind, it's in reference to Charles Dickens's book. And the chapter starts off where Gradgrind is addressing his class. And he's talking about the value of facts, 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 more facts, testing the validity of facts with more facts. And people used to quote this and cite it frequently in the 70s and 80s in order to make the case for a change in education. And the thinking of liberals and progressives in the 70s and 80s was that this emphasis on content, on facts, as the end-all and be-all of education, of what education is about, was leading to more and more objective testing, the search for right answers as opposed to wrong answers. And it was doing all of that in place of getting students involved in the material to the point that they really understood what they were studying. That in a sense, what we were talking about was memorization, not understanding. And the thinking was that the way you improve the quality of education is by employing strategies where students can begin to understand and appreciate and take positions and see different points of view and all the rest of it. And the more of that, and that's why they felt that this all begins with the way children are taught to read. That if the only reading they ever do is phonic, is through phonics, which is sounding out syllables into words and then looking at how words comprise phrases and sentences. then the fact of the matter is, unless you really pursue education beyond where most people do, chances are that students never get to experience the excitement of learning or the thrill of knowledge, the thrill of discovery, or the beauty of language and the beauty of poetry and the beauty of the arts and all of the things that those that really support education believe in. And the assumption is that too many students are being denied access to any of this because of this overemphasis on phonics and learning to read words and not worrying about what they mean, and the emphasis on facts and facts and facts and right answers and wrong answers and true or false tests and fill in the blanks and all of these other things. And so that really drove the whole language curriculum. But in the 70s and 80s, conservatives reacted very violently against the whole language movement and began to defend phonics and began to defend knowledge-based, content-based education as being the basis of education as it has always existed. And so what the debate ended up becoming was a debate over whether, in fact, we're going to try to find a way to educate everybody in this society, or whether we are going to continue the practices of old, which is to employ an education system which leaves a lot of victims along the way, but for those who make it all the way through, they become our well-educated people. In other words, it becomes a very elitist approach to education. Everybody gets exposed to it, but only the very few can benefit from it. But on the other hand, it's that approach that allowed American education to be #1 in every measurement aspect in the world when compared with other systems of education. What Jane Robbins is suggesting here about the Common Core standards is the same thing, that the real issue here is political. That what's behind this reform movement is not improving education, but turning students into liberals. That's what she's suggesting. Just as the argument against whole language in the 70s and 80s was that this approach to reading was designed principally to build in all of these liberal priorities and principles into curriculum. That it was going to be liberal ideas that found their way into the curriculum. That was going to be the whole language that students were going to wrestle with. And now, Jane Robbins is suggesting the same kind of an agenda is behind the Common Core standards. Because the emphasis is not on knowledge, the emphasis is on critical thinking and higher order skills. And so she's suggesting here very strongly that there's a real liberal agenda behind all of this. And given, as I say, given the fact that this is the Journal of the National Association of Scholars, which is a very conservative group from the get-go, then this particular position that Jane Robbins is adopting here towards the standards is really very consistent with the philosophy that drives this publication and this organization. In other words, this is an article that seems to fit very well into these publications. And what she points out, for example, is that from here on in, under the common standards, schools would be increasingly held accountable to the federal government, not to parents or to local communities. That in effect, the Common Core standards amounts to a federal takeover of education, of K through 12 education. And then she goes on and says, as federal control increased, so did the influence of early 20th century progressives who believed that the economy and society should be centrally managed and directed by experts. In other words, she sees this flow of power toward Washington, towards the Department of Education as very consistent with the progressive era in American history at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, looking to the federal government for more education, more expertise, and more control. And then she mentions John Dewey, and she mentions the heirs to John Dewey's thought by saying the heirs to progressive thought decided that education should be reshaped to be utilitarian, designed to produce not more complete people, but more useful people. And so the suggestion here is that what we're seeing in the Common Core is a revisit to the old debates over progressivism and turning education into something utilitarian rather than something idealistic or something of individual of worth in its own right.
Hey, Dr. Dill.
Yes, Bob.
Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to let you know that Jeff is on the line with an observation and a question.
Sure.
All right, stand by.
Go right ahead. Thanks.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Hello, Dr. Bill. How are you?
Jeff, I'm great. How are you?
Oh, I'm warmer than Bob Kincaid is right now, but otherwise I'm doing fine.
Oh, yeah. Did he tell on his program last night the story about not having any ductwork?
Yeah, well, I spoke with him yesterday before the program, but I did hear that story about not having ductwork.
It is really cold. I mean, we're in the 20s here today.
Well, so am I, but I say it's as cold as the witch's nose here.
Yeah.
Because it's not that cold yet.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point I'm making is, I'm listening to the programming, and I love you guys because you really know the Constitution. But the problem is all these problems stem thousands and thousands of years before the Constitution was written, and the Constitution was written for wealthy people, minority, to control the game.
Yeah.
No. So if that's the case, why are we chasing our tail? We're not saying we shouldn't look at history, but you mentioned Howard Zen on your program last night, and I love one thing about Zen saying that he believes that humanity, we keep on looking at history, but we have to know history enough to know how to change history.
Exactly.
The only way we're going to be able to change the history is figuring out where this economic system started from. It's not a question of liberalism or conservatism. It is now. But the reality is we want to talk about humanitarianism to help the humane system, not just in this country, but around the world now where you have peace. So the question I have is, does anyone ever ask, and I don't mean this, nastily, where did the kings come from? Are they truly blue blood? No, it's not that at all. They don't have blue blood. I mean, even though some people say there's green blood from Washington, but I'm not going to buy that. I'm kidding. No, but I'm saying to you that ask the question where this all started with people who were bullies, maybe 5,000 years ago. I may be off 1,000 or so years. I'm not sure. But you had a bully, and he fought with someone, and he got another bully, and then they got another bully, and they created an army. And the army took over the poor, the people who weren't strong, and they said, you can give a certain amount of bushels of whatever, and that's going to go to our king. Now, they made him a king. He didn't have blue blood. He was a thug. And now we have rule of law. Now, rule of law, to what degree? Whose laws and who's ruling? It's still the same thing with rule of law.
Laws are written by the people with power to keep it.
Exactly my point. So if we can do the programming to say, how do we change the existing system without killing people to a degree where we have a humanitarian economic system, that and I always say the psychopaths who are running the world, and the reason they're psychopathic is the more money they make, and they don't care who they kill along the way. But if we could figure out that a humanitarian economic system that gives everybody education primarily, food and shelter, and shelter meaning safe to have your food and education and sleep and respected by humans, other humans. And they only can do it for, let's say, 15 hours a week. But if you want to work more, you can. Then the people who are busting their chops, making millions and millions of dollars, 5, 10, 1,000 times more than somebody else, they wouldn't be psychopathic. They'd be hard workers.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're not letting people die like we are now. And if we could do this on a worldwide basis, you wouldn't have any more wars. And you'd be able to figure out a tax base that's fair. And someone who's educated, such as you are, I am, or they may be worth a little more than the guy sweeping the floor, but not that much more. And we all live about 100 years if we're lucky. And we all eat 2 million calories of food and water a year. And we all have a certain blood pressure. And we all have pretty much the same stuff, except some are more ambitious and some are more educated. So you can put a measurement on this by some axiom, a mathematical axiom or something, if we can get a professor to do that.
Yeah.
But I think we're spinning our wheels by just going on and on and on about Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and how we're educating them. You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, but there's one issue here. And the issue is what you're saying is let's all accept the fact that this is all a conspiracy against the average people. Now let's figure out what to do. And the point is that everybody is not there, Jeff. Everybody does not agree with that. And the point is that it's very obvious that we've got a lot of things going on and a lot of people making a case for their particular set of priorities, if you will. And so it's very important to work these out because education is ultimately going to be the vehicle by which things start to change. But you're saying let's not take the time for the education. Let's start writing chapter 55, and you can't do that.
No, not at all. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying to you that the educational system is controlled by the monetary system, which is controlled by the economic system. And as long as the economic system controls the political system and the educational system and any other systems you choose to, that economic system is totally going to be corrupted. It's corrupting all the other systems. So you have to, if I become a guy who can actually change the world, either they're going to shoot me or cut me off somehow. I'm the head of the snake. But the reality is there's no head to the economic system. It's just had evolved over several thousands or 10,000 or 5,000, I don't know how many years. So we're all into this system that we can't see because it's just so big. It's a cannibalistic system. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying to you that we don't need to have a war, overthrow, or even all we need to do is subtly, not get everybody involved with it. The inalienable rights that human beings have is not the pursuit of happiness. Those are just words. Life is what you got. Liberty is what you don't have because you don't have education, which is primarily, so you need education, which is an inalienable right. Your mother teaches you how to dress or what to eat or how to wash your hands or whatever. That's an inalienable right, and you can go to higher education if you choose. The right to have food, which is clean air, clean water, and clean calories, and the right for shelter, which is a safe place, not fancy, a safe place of which you can have these things and sleep, and you respect, and humanity respects that space. So those are the three inalienable rights. Without those rights, you don't have liberty. And the pursuit of happiness is an insane word. How can you I can give you anything you want, but if you're not happy in your head, that's your problem. I can't change that. So the pursuit of happiness is just nonsense. And life is what you're born with. So there's something radically wrong with the way the language, and I believe it's intentionally written like that, and I believe they couldn't have ever gotten the Constitution passed unless they put in the Bill of Rights. But that's my personal belief. I'm just trying to say that if you can please, let's get another. You probably know enough philosophers and historians to go as far back as we can go to see where the economic system started. And if you can do the program with them and then bring us up to date on what's going on in our Constitution and today, we can see where this problem's arising and then are arising from, and then how we can possibly think about changing it. So I'm saying to you that somehow we have to have the minimum whatever, and not figured in currency, has to be education, food, and shelter for your inalienable right, and we need the collective unconscious to move it forward worldwide. And once we accept that as the basis, you've changed the whole game.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. I do understand what you're saying. I just feel that most of us, we've all grown up in this society, and we've all been. I mean, we're talking at the beginning of the program about institutions. I mean, the nature of institutions is to basically teach and perpetuate values and ideals and the same definitions of goods and bads. And so ultimately, as you point out, we need to realize that the people who initially started these have skin in the game. They have an objective. They have an agenda.
And so actually they have no skin in the game because they got it.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is that part of education is to basically get people to begin to see and think in different ways, and to begin to understand and appreciate ideas and issues that they never really thought about before. That's a very, very tedious process, but it's a very important one, because
I'm concurring with that, but the point is you're still trying to get those ideas out to specifically to an educated population, and basically the people who we need to get it out to is the
Jeff, I'm not really trying to get ideas out to anybody. And what I mean is I don't have an agenda. What I'm basically focusing my attention on is looking at what we've got and trying to figure it out and understand it. And what I'm trying to do is share what I've learned about that over the years with other people. But what people do with what they learn is their choice, not mine.
When I hear you speak, I hear you speaking about what is now, and this is what is now, and this is how you're teaching it. I learned a lot from listening to your programming, by the way. But what I'm hearing is that the system was set up in such a way where the wealthy controlled the way the Constitution was written, where the way the educational system is working at is to try to teach people on how to think, which is what you're saying. But it's very difficult to do that because you're doing it when you talked about putting ladders up, having the right leaders to put what ladder up against what wall. But the trouble is there is a dome over the whole thing that nobody sees, and the dome that nobody sees is the economic system that controls all those walls, and no one even sees that as the problem. And it takes an awful lot to say, my education and my food and my shelter should be an alienable right that has no value as far as a monetary value.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we need to, once we've understand that all human beings have to have education. It's part of the inalienable right, higher or straight across the body, basic education. You're entirely right, but if you have to pay for that education, you're back in the economic system again.
Yeah.
And the same thing holds true with food. And the reason why you have the problem of fracking and the way the system is killing our entire planet and poisoning people with no regard for anything whatsoever is not because people are just bad people. They're bad people because they're grown up and are bad. If you're taught to be a soldier and kill people, that's your job. And that's how you're taught. If you're taught to be accountable, eating human beings or gobbling up companies to maybe get the better of them, that's okay. It's acceptable behavior, and that's only because of the way the economic system works. So I'm just very simply saying, if we could subtly put forth a humanitarian economic system that takes into account that every human being, sweeping the floor, or a professor or a doctor, working 15 to 20 hours a week, is entitled to the education, food, and shelter. That's the basic debate around the world. And you know, what's his name? The pyramid guy. He's basically saying the same thing, but no one's put a measurement onto it. I'm suggesting we need to get some kind of a measurement. You know, you have a doctor. They want 20 measurements out of your body. You told me it's 20 degrees where you are right now. I know what that means. It's not 75 like in Florida.
Yeah.
I know what that temperature means. If you're telling me you're 150 miles from the capital, I can buy that. If you're 190 miles, I can buy that too. I understand what that means. But if you don't give me a measurement to work with, I have no way of changing anything.
Okay. Okay. I see where I see where you're coming from, Jeff.
Okay, I just wanted to bring, but ask if you can get someone out there to tell me where the kings came from. That would be an interesting. Then we bring it up to what it is today. That would take a week, but it would be a great thing to talk about. Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye now.
Bye now. We are at 5 minutes after the hour. Let's pause for a few moments and just time to stretch, and then we'll come back and we'll pursue our conversation here at the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien. Stay with us. We'll be right back. So anyway, welcome back. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you've been with us the whole hour, the first hour, we've been looking at the issue of the Common Core and mainly looking at criticisms of it. We're looking at an article written in criticism of the Common Core by Jane Robbins, and I just wanted to continue this because I really believe that it lays out an awful lot of the detail that the letter that we looked at yesterday really doesn't get into. Basically, well, let me go back to Jane Robbins because I think that the next point I wanted to make, you remember we were talking about her comment that with progressive education and the emphasis on making education more utilitarian, more useful, it was designed to produce not more complete people but more useful people. And of course, the reality is that this stuff didn't start with the progressive period. If you read Benjamin Franklin's creation of the College of Philadelphia, which ultimately leads to the University of Pennsylvania, becomes the University of Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin's whole idea was to basically turn education somewhat away from the classics where it had always been, and making it much more practical and much more useful for people to live their day-to-day lives. And he was talking about, in Philadelphia during the late colonial period and the early history of the nation's existence, Philadelphia was one of the most exciting, dynamic commercial centers in the world. And people needed to know how to do things. Business people needed to know how to keep books and how to add and how to project and how to speculate and all those other things. And he wanted an institution that would focus on a much more useful, utilitarian, practical approach to education. So John Dewey did not create this. I mean, this goes all the way back to the founders. But to strengthen her case even more, she talks about Mark Tucker, Mark Tucker was the president of the National Center on Education and the Economy, and also he is a member of the Common Core's development team, the people that really helped develop the Common Core standards. And she quotes from a letter that Mark Tucker wrote to Hillary Clinton shortly after the 1992 presidential election when Bill Clinton was elected president. In this letter, which actually appears in the congressional record, Tucker advocated educational reform that went way beyond creating separate vocational schools for careers. Tucker talked about, and this is a quote, remolding the entire American system into a seamless web that literally extends from cradle to grave. This web, Robbins says, would be coordinated by a system of labor market boards at the local, state, and federal levels where counselors would engage in job matching and accessing the integrated computer-based program. In other words, what Tucker is talking about, and he was instrumental in the creation of the Common Core, is to basically transform in a major way the entire educational system in order to turn it into what he called a seamless web that literally extends from cradle to grave. And so increasingly through the Clinton administration, we begin to get programs like the Workforce Investment Act in the late 90s, talking about public workforce education. The federal government is putting all sorts of money into education. We had I was involved in this. We had the very prominent, right around the turn of the millennium, right around 2000, we had the very active school to work program where there was an effort to try to take students out of the classroom and actually put them in the workplace so they could get some valuable experience, going back to the old idea of the 1950s and 60s of cooperative education, and on and on and on. And so basically what Robbins is seeing here is a conspiracy to take control of the K-12 education system and turn it into a preparation for work. And part of that is to dumb down the academic side of education. And here's the real first red flag that I got when I read this article. She said, as Tucker and colleagues worked to convert schools into workforce training academies, leftists in academia devoted their attention to ensuring that students embraced the correct beliefs. Terrorist-turned-education professor William Ayers, you may remember during the last campaign, the argument was that education professor William Ayers had this incredible impact and effect on President Obama, and the fact that he was a terrorist turned education professor. And they began to come up with goals like social justice and multiculturalism and all the rest of it. So she really sees a liberal conspiracy here to take control of the education system. And she goes on and says that the philosophy of John Dewey underlines this theory of politicized education. Dewey discouraged the teaching of facts in favor of the Rousseauian vision of allowing the child to discover knowledge through his own experience, working with others as members of a self-directed learning community. Dewey emphasized, quote, the development of critical, socially engaged intelligence, which enables individuals to understand and participate effectively in the affairs of their communities in a collaborative effort to achieve a common good. So basically what we're seeing here is an emphasis that the Common Core standards really emanate from the philosophical position of liberals and progressives whose principal goal is to basically take over and reform the entire education system of America and make it not a system that answers to parents and local communities, which is the tradition of education in America, but a system that is answerable to Washington, to the Federal Department of Education. And then she goes into the Common Cores themselves, especially English education, and what would happen to English education under this system. And she makes the statement. Some of her comments some of her language kind of suggests a lot more that you can grab onto than the rather amorphous, vague language in the letter we saw yesterday. Basically, what she talks about is the transition of an education system designed to produce right-thinking cogs for an economic machine. This redirection, it is claimed, will result in more rigorous demands on students and better prepare them for the needs of 21st century jobs. But under this model, the vague notion of critical thinking seems to replace the requirements that students accumulate real knowledge of the subject matter. Now she gets into a few examples, and she makes reference to Dr. Sandra Stotsky, and we met her yesterday. With few exceptions, the ELA standards, the English Language Association standards, do not require students to develop knowledge of any particular literary works. For example, other than a bit of Shakespeare, the standards completely dispense with British literature. Dr. Stotsky, who served on the Common Core Validation Committee but refused to sign off on these standards, has expressed concern about their content-free nature. She describes them as developing empty skill sets, such as the ability to discern the main idea in a literary work. A skill, she wryly points out, that can be employed on Moby Dick or on the Three Little Pigs. In other words, the quality of literature that children are exposed to, it doesn't matter if you're focusing on the how-tos and the skills that these people have in mind. And so consequently, the more time that the classroom teacher spends on teaching these skills, the less time there is for reading Shakespeare or reading Dickens or Hawthorne or anybody else. And so she argues, Dr. Stotsky and others argue, that what we really need to do is increase youngsters' exposure to classical literature, not decrease it, not diminish it. And then she says, whether or not it works, the Common Core philosophy diminishes the rich benefits that all students gain from studying great literature. I mark this paragraph as key, and this is the point at which I'd like to pause for a moment. Whether or not the Common Core works, she says, the philosophy diminishes the rich benefits that all students gain from studying great literature. Understanding bedrock themes and challenges that underlie all of human experience, considering differing perspectives and points of view, vicariously learning empathy and prudential decision-making, appreciating and perhaps emulating the well-crafted phrase, sentence, and paragraph, and exploring places and times other than their own. Under Common Core, there will be less time for literary journeys such as these. They will not help a kid fill out a job application. I circled 3 words in that paragraph. And the 3 words are, benefits all students. What Jane Robbins is obviously saying here is that education which is based on knowledge rather than skills, traditional education, enables these literary journeys that she talks about. It enables people to get into the questions that have moved mankind forever so that they can develop real appreciation and understanding of the various aspects of the human experience. The issue that I would raise, however, is the idea that this approach to education benefits all students. I would suggest to you that that's really the issue here. This approach, which emphasizes content as opposed to the skills, may be available to all students, but generations of practice tell us that few students in the long term benefit from it. We're graduating. How many people that start college, what percentage graduate? Depending on the school, of course, it changes. But the fact of the matter is, our education system has been, from the very beginning, a program designed to separate the wheat from the chaff. A program to find what Jefferson called the cream of ability. A competitive system designed to rank people and find out who can benefit from a quality education and who probably cannot. It is an approach to education which is not capturing and exciting all students. It is an approach to education which is doing exactly the opposite. Those who are defending it the most are people that have experienced success in it. But for every one of those, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people for whom education has become a horrendous experience. And the fact of the matter is, the kinds of skills that the Common Core is addressing are the same skills that have been reserved only for the elite. And now the Common Core skills movement is designed to try to give everybody access to these skills so that everybody can experience whatever success there is to be had in the educational experience. We can predict, we've been able to predict generation after generation who's going to make it and who's not. Education, school is an institution. Going back to the idea of institutions, we learn very quickly how to be successful in this system. Keep your mouth shut. Don't get a reputation for being a troublemaker. Don't get a reputation for somebody who always has the wrong answer. The only way to not be wrong is to not to say anything until somebody gives you the answer. There's always an answer. Somebody's always got it. It's never you. It's the teacher or the book or the article or the curriculum guide or the State Board of Education or the Department of Education. Somebody's got all the answers, but it's never you. And so the answers are thrown out there, and you're told to memorize them. You're not given the skills to separate the answers that matter from the answers that don't. That's not in your bailiwick. That's not up to you. I can remember coming home from school when I was a kid, and my mother saying, "How was school?" And I'd say, "Oh, it was great. Nobody even knew I was there. I just went from class to class. I got nobody trouble. Nobody called on me. There was no stress, no pressure. I got to see my friends. I got to have a good lunch. I got to come home with my friends after school. It's a pretty good day, Mom. Thanks." What we're turning out, the Puritans used to believe. If you look at the way Puritans looked at education, they felt that education was kind of a morality builder. That Cotton Mather talked about children as empty vessels, and the role of the teacher is to fill that empty vessel with truth. And you had to do it before somebody else filled it with falsehood. And so the idea was that the whole idea behind education was to disseminate truth, not to raise questions, not to encourage thinking, not to do any of that stuff. It is a rigorous, disciplined process. and we lose a lot of our young people along the way. So it doesn't benefit all students. Not really. I mean, I'm one of those who believe that if you happen to go and see a performance of Shakespeare, you will be forever improved by it. But I can't say that it's going to make your quality of your life better and all of that. I don't know that. But that's basically what we're talking about here. We are talking about skills that have been reserved for the people who have earned the right to be exposed to them, which is the elite. This nation took on the responsibility of giving educational opportunity to everybody. Not compromising standards, but trying to do everything we can to help as many youngsters as possible meet those high standards. And that means learning some of the tricks of the trade, so to speak. That's what we're talking about here, is fulfilling the real meaning of American exceptionalism. Or trying to. There's absolutely no question that there's danger here. Because this idea that we are turning out career-ready people so that they can become useful members of the workforce, we really need to think about that. That's something all of us need to be aware of and conscious of and sensitive to. But the fact of the matter is, I agree that teaching skills without content is meaningless. It's empty. It's like teaching people how to read. There are tremendous rewards from being able to read, but learning how to read is painful. One of the greatest books that I ever read in my whole life was written by a philosopher who passed away a number of years ago. And the title of the book is How to Read a Book. The author, Mortimer Adler. Mortimer Adler was instrumental in developing great books curriculum at places like the University of Chicago and some of the best colleges and universities in the world. His paperback, called How to Read a Book, is spectacular. What he tells us, what he teaches us in that book, is that the initial stages of literacy, which is learning how to read, phonics, unfortunately, for most people, defines the extent of their ability to read. The vast majority of people in this country, Mortimer Adler says, never learned to read beyond the basic elements of literacy. They are being educated not to think, but to be told what to think. Because the higher order skills, the skills of analysis and synthesis and being able to do research and being able to raise the right questions, this is a level of education that very, very few people in society ever are exposed to. Mortimer Adler wrote this book I believe in the 40s, in the 1940s or the 1950s. So this debate is not new. But his book, entitled How to Read a Book, is a blueprint for how to go beyond the basic level of reading into real literacy, which is analytical reading, which is critical reading. And very few students ever get there until they go to college. And the fact of the matter is, there are many people who go to college that never experience it either. So basically, what I see the Common Core standards doing is giving everybody access to the keys to the kingdom. And I find resistance to it as politically motivated as the people trying to defend the current system suggest that the Common Core standards movement is politically motivated. And I think that this is critically important. Because I would suggest to you, and I think if you think about it and think about your own education, you'll begin to appreciate this as well. How many people are educated well enough to read Shakespeare at all? Look at the time we spent on the Federalist Papers. Look at the time we spent on Madison Federalist number 10. How many people can read that? The political reality of the times is that it was written in a way which basically presumed that most people wouldn't be able to read it and understand it. But the few can understand it. If the vast majority of the citizenry of this country understood what Madison was saying in Federalist number 10, the Constitution of the United States would never have been ratified. Never. That doesn't mean that I'm critical of it. I think under the circumstances, Madison was doing what he felt he had to do. And I'm not too sure he was wrong. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a system, in a society, which is committed to goals that we've really never taken seriously before. Now we may be seeing an opportunity to change that. Of course, there's workplace readiness associated with this. Of course, we're talking about workplace skills. Of course, we're talking about giving people the tools they need to earn a respectable living for themselves and their dependents and their families. Of course. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't know how to read Madison or you don't know how to read Shakespeare, then you're not going to read it. Every kid walking the street has a library card. The libraries aren't overflowing with people. They're not hiring extra staff to handle the crowds of people who want to go in and grab as many books as they can. So we're basically talking about an education system that is potentially failing an awful lot of people. It doesn't mean that content is not important. Of course it is. The answer to this is to teach the reading with the sources, with the content. Content-based reading. Not teaching people how to read The Three Little Pigs, but sitting down together with people and together reading Shakespeare or James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or whatever it is that people couldn't read before. Once people begin to understand what they read, they will read better. And they will read more, and they will become voracious readers. Because once education starts to happen, once people realize that education's not in the book, Education is what happens to me from reading the book. But before it can happen, I got to understand what's in that book. Once that happens, then all we need to do is get out of the way. Because we will be turning out people thirsty for knowledge and understanding and appreciation. There's so much to learn. There's so much to know. Technology puts it all at our fingertips with the internet. But while the website, the federal website on healthcare, is being overwhelmed by people trying to sign up for healthcare, the internet is not being overwhelmed by people who want to read the classics. You can get, Plato's Republic online for nothing. But I've never gone into it and been told that there's already too many people on that website and you're going to have to wait. So basically what we're talking about here is a change in the way people look at learning. And the way to initiate that change is to find ways to let education really happen. And that means what you bring to the content. The content is there to begin with. If you can't read it, and you can't comprehend what you read, and you don't understand the issues and the points being raised, if you can't read well enough to derive some of the real benefits of that particular piece of text, then you'll never go back. And so basically, that's the issue, is using the content, meaningful pieces of literature, meaningful pieces of history, to teach reading. Primary sources, documents, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Benjamin Rush, all of them. Read what they said. Read what they believed and how they are thinking on paper. Many of these letters are extremely long that these people write. They're kind of journal entries. And if you read them, what they're doing is speculating. They're thinking on paper. Emerson, among Emerson's essays, some his essays are just absolutely spectacular. But one of the ones that I like the best is Emerson's essay on history. And what Emerson points out, and I don't know if you've ever thought of this, every time I think of it, I get chills. I get bumps, skin bumps. Emerson points out that in reading history, you can read the same things that Plato read, the same things that Julius Caesar read. And if you engage these pieces of literature intellectually, then potentially you are thinking the same thoughts as did Julius Caesar and Napoleon and Plato and St. Paul. How can you possibly put down a discipline which allows you to think about the same issues that some of the greatest minds of all time have ever thought about before? But in order to do that, you got to know how to do it. And our system of education has not been doing that. The Common Core indeed suggests that this might be the beginning of a turnaround. And finally, there's one other issue here related in Jane Robbins' article, which I want to get to before we go off the air. We're approaching 45 minutes after the hour. She points out, if K-12 education is to be transformed by Common Core, so inevitably must higher education. The stated goal of the federally funded consortia creating Common Core aligned tests and of the National Governors Association, which owns the standards, is to have colleges and universities agree to accept a particular test score as sufficient to place a student directly into freshman courses without remediation. I would suggest to you that there's a kind of a self-interested agenda here amongst these critics as well. And it's the idea that if Common Core works, if K through 12 education really begins to rebound, if test scores on reading comprehension and the ability to analyze and think through complex issues and problems actually begin to go up, then the next target's going to be higher education itself. And these people are all in that, and they don't want that. In this publication, there's a second article on Common Core, and the author of this is an English professor, Mark Borlein. Mark Borlein teaches English at Emory University in Atlanta. I've read a number of things that Mark has written. He's a critic. In fact, he joined Sandra Stotsky in some of the major criticisms of the Common Core standards. But his article pretty much criticizes the Jane Robbins article that we just looked at, claiming that much of the things that she says are true, but actually she's going way too far. She's being overly critical of the Common Core standards. And he's focusing on English, on literature. Naturally, when I looked at the standards, I focused on history. And what I saw in the standards, and I was teaching teachers, what I saw in the learning standards was statements like, at the end of this unit, students will be able to do the following, and there's a whole list of skills that they'll have. They will be able to rank from the most important to the least important. They will be able to compare and contrast. They will be able to understand social, political, and economic motives to behavior. They will be able to analyze. They will be able to spot intent and prejudice and bias. And I thought to myself, all of these are higher order skills. Not all that many of the teachers that I'm accustomed to, that I've encountered, could do that themselves, let alone teach it to kids. So in effect, the Common Core standards directly address the need for teachers to begin teaching content at a totally different level than they've been in the past. Borlein, in his somewhat, very kind, gentle criticism of Jane Robbins, includes some of the standards from the Common Core in literature. For grades 9 and 10, for example, he points out two standards that he prints, and I'll share these with you. The first one, this is for 9th and 10th graders in reading literature. Analyze a particular point of view or cultural experience reflected in a work of literature from outside the United States, drawing on a wide reading of world literature. That's the standard for 9th and 10th grades in English, in literature. And every school system that's adopted the common standards, this is a goal for teaching literature to 9th and 10th graders. Students will be able to analyze a particular point of view or cultural experience reflected in a work of literature from outside the United States, drawing on a wide reading of world literature. Right there in black and white is the reality, is the assumption that in order to meet that standard, students are going to have to draw from a wide reading of world literature, which means that they'll have to read some literature. Or there's no way to meet that standard. The second one, analyze how an author draws on and transforms source materials in a specific work. For example, how Shakespeare treats a theme or topic from Ovid or the Bible, or how a later author draws on a play by Shakespeare. In other words, taking things that occurred in one era and transposing them for knowledge purposes into another era and say, what can we learn from the first situation that allows us to understand the second one? In other words, the ability to transfer skills in one situation to another situation. Neither one of those, it seems to me, falls into the realm of teaching empty skills like the Three Little Pigs. In grades 11 and 12, there are two standards that specifically require Shakespeare. 11 and 12. 1. Determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in the text, including figurative and connotative meanings. Analyze the impact of specific word choices on meaning and tone, including words with multiple meanings or language that is particularly fresh, engaging, and beautiful. Include Shakespeare as well as other authors. So if the objective is to be able to recognize and appreciate language that is especially fresh and engaging and beautiful, and to look to Shakespeare as well as other authors for this, that's substance, that's content. But it's content, it's reading with a purpose, it's reading with a goal. Second standard. Analyze multiple interpretations of a story, drama, or poem. Example, recorded or live production of a play or recorded novel or poetry. Evaluating how each version interprets the source text. Include at least one play by Shakespeare and one play by an American dramatist. So you're kind of struck with the idea of mention of the beautiful in these things, and the mention of Shakespeare as well as other authors, and the need to be able to draw. In other words, if a teacher is really going to take these Common Core standards seriously and is going to address them and try very hard to make sure that students meet these standards, then students are going to have to read good stuff. So the criticism that it's all how to and none of it is what are not true. What Berline points out in his article is that many of the criticisms that Jane Robbins has of Common Core go overboard a little bit. But he agrees with her that there were real issues and real dangers. But his sense is if you read the standards carefully in literature, there's enough substance in them that it's not a giveaway. In fact, his position is that actually these are an improvement content-wise over what existed before. But he points out the real challenge is going to be to get teachers to meet these standards. And my position is it's going to be difficult to do that when these are standards that teachers, many of them, have never had the opportunity to meet themselves. A key paragraph in Berline's article says the following: this fact and the National Council of Teacher Education, NCTE, project managers to ignore, thereby indicating the real weakness of Common Core, giving educators enough wiggle room to neglect the content mandate and containing so much other non-content material, writing and research skills, speaking and listening strand, various and non-historical acts of reading comprehension, that classics and foundations may be disregarded. In other words, his concern with the Common Core is not what they include. It's the fact that in many cases they're so vague that they give teachers an out. and they don't require teachers to live up to these as they are written. There's too much opportunity for teachers to skate around and avoid some of the more rigorous aspects of these Common Core standards. The difference between him and Jane Robbins is he doesn't believe that the Common Core lacks standards. He believes that more than anything it lacks the ability, they lack the ability to force teachers to adhere to them. But he acknowledges that for the first time these things are really in these standards. They never were before. And so in a sense what we've got here is not an answer to our education problems. We have an opportunity to address them in ways that we've never been able to successfully do before. I'm not willing to abandon the standards because they might be abused. I'm much more willing. I find it very encouraging that 45 states have bought into these standards. Now the next step is to get people to actually live up to them. And that means teaching teachers how to do them. I see underwriting all of this is an incredible reform movement in the way we prepare our teachers. That has to change. We have got to begin to look upon our teachers as not only classroom masters of education, delivery of education, but also as scholars. We have got to educate our teachers in ways which give them an opportunity to appreciate knowledge and substance and content. If they appreciate it, the skills needed to reach that appreciation will happen. And once teachers have it, they'll find a way to get it to kids because it's too exciting not to. Everything that teachers have always claimed was lacking in the classroom, which is students motivated to learn, is potentially at a point of change right here. I think that this is very exciting. I don't have a problem with all the states operating on the same standards because I think we all know what the basic text and foundations are. We all know what students need to be familiar with and learn about American history and about civic education and about literature and about English literature and about American literature. We want people to read Thoreau and Emerson and Hawthorne. We want people to read Cotton Mather. We want people to read the classics. But in order to read them and expect people to read them, we've got to, they must be able to really understand them. And in order to do that, they need to have access to skills that heretofore have been available only to the few and not to the many. I think that's the challenge. I think it's an exciting one. I'm kind of encouraged. I obviously won't be here long enough to see this thing actually work out. But in my years of studying education, this is the first time that I really see a serious effort to give everybody a shot at quality education. I've told students in history classes that I teach, I usually try to do this in my syllabus, but I don't address other people's classes in my syllabus. That would be unfair. I'm professional. But I usually try to tell them at some point, if you are in a history class and you're never asked or given the opportunity to address the relevance and significance of key issues, if your history class is nothing but somebody telling you what the truth is and you writing it down, then you need to know that you're being cheated. The value of history is what we learn from it. In order to learn from it, we have to bring questions to it. In order to bring questions to it, we have to learn how to do that. Our system, heretofore, has been focused on getting rid of everybody that doesn't seem to have the potential to pick up those skills. Educating the cream. What Jefferson called periodic skimmings of the cream of ability. The world we're in now suggests that everybody needs to be educated. We need everybody pulling together. We can't afford to dismiss 85% of our population because they don't meet standards. To a point, everybody meets standards to a certain level. Let's give them the opportunity to reach it. Let's give people the opportunity to begin to realize their own potential rather than spending our time trying to prove to people that they don't have any. Let's revisit and return to the kind of attitudes that caused people to go into teaching anyway. People didn't go into education to get rich. People went into education because they really felt that they could and wanted to make a difference. I think we're on the cusp of a real opportunity for people to really begin to make that difference for kids that never had a shot before. And because it's preparing people for the workplace, I don't think it's an either-or at all. The kinds of skills involved in these higher-order skills are the same kind of skills that can be translated into the workplace. Ranking and analyzing and evaluating and comparing and contrasting translates very easily into problem solving, which is a key in today's modern workplace. Looking at history and looking at literature in terms of the way people who are different find ways to live together and work together in peace and harmony and to really build community. That's something that you can take and move into the workplace, into neighborhoods, into communities, into the nation. All this stuff works. We have reached the top of our second hour and our time together is done. I want to thank you. I want to thank Jeff for calling. Thank you all for listening. Please have a wonderful week. Be safe. We'll see you back here at the Virtual Center this coming Monday. And again, a reminder, it'll be 1 hour early, 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, and be safe.